So I've been talking to people about pure assessments quite a lot recently, and particularly talking about risk assessments and touching on the subjectivity that we run into when we're doing things like 3x3 or 5x5 risk matrices. And one of the things, well, the background we come from a world of kind of CE marking and using legislation and standards, particularly harmonized standards, to steer our risk assessment. So it removes some of that subjectivity. It makes it much more founded in legislation, in industry best practice, in industry standards. So I know that I've kind of spoken about where you can find harmonized standards, and that is a key item here. But I want to show you kind of what does it look like in the physical, what does a report look like, and where do we get the items within the harmonized standard? Where do we find the hazards that are being identified? Where do we find the control mitigations? Where do we find the potential solutions to be implemented? And how do we put all that together? So I've got an example of a report here. So we were looking at a forge press, an open forge press, and a manipulator. So what we've got is a bit of a description just of the equipment that we were looking at. We've identified the legislation that's applicable. So here we were particularly looking at the machinery directive. We've identified the primary standards. So we've got two. So one is for the open die hot forging press. So this is EN 14673. And then we've also got this manipulator as well. So even though there's some manipulator requirements within EN 14673, there is also a standard for cranes and manually manipulating devices. So we've also taken some of the guidance, some of the hazard identification from that one as well, and we've also used that. So they're the two standards that we've used as the basis of our assessment and thus our risk assessment. So the bits that we pulled from it, I'm just going to open one of those standards now. So this is 14673, and show you within the standard where are these items found. Okay, so this is a harmonized standard. It's recognized as kind of quasi-legal by the European Union as meeting or fulfilling the requirements of the essential health and safety requirements of the machinery directive. And we can actually see that here. So this has been listed within the official journal. It can be found within the list of harmonized standards on the EU Commission website. And we have previously touched on where to find those. So what we've got here is we've got section 5.2, and this is a list of significant hazards, hazardous situations, safety requirements or measures. So they've identified the significant hazardous situations, and they've listed them down here. So you've got significant hazards. What are they? General, combination, slips, trips, and falls. And then you've got whatever the hazardous situation is that's occurring with the machine at the time. And then you've got the safety requirement or the measure. Now, there's actually another reference within this document that gives you a more tangible, a more specific safety measure that is required to mitigate, to control whatever the hazard is. But this is the backbone of your risk assessment. And this is reasonably extensive. So as you can see, this also covers things like the hydraulics for the machine, electrical hazards, thermal hazards, particularly focusing on, what is the safety issue. So if we have a loss of power, for example, due to a failure of energy supply, is it the case that there needs to be provided emergency energy for the control system? Or what happens with the hydraulic system if power is lost? Do we need a hydraulic system that can switch to a safe mode, that is able to hold the press in position so that we're not going to have any unexpected movement, we're not going to have a hazardous scenario occur? We've got items in here for the movement of manipulators. So what's the hazard in this case? Well, we've got crushing, shearing, severing, entanglement, and what is required. So here we've stated, or it has been stated within the standard, that there needs to be a restriction on the access to the area behind the manipulator and between the manipulator and the press. And then in these sections here, so 5.1.10, for example, or in EN 61496 part 1, there's further requirements on what it looks like to meet those. But let's take this next one down. So it's the case that with regard to movement of manipulators, the operator needs to have direct view to the danger zone and where needed, visual aids to be provided. So we're thinking about mirrors, CCTV. So if we jump to section 5.1.15, so 5.1.15, so this expands on what is required for operator visibility. So a good operator's visibility to the operating process shall be provided where it is not possible to prevent access to hazardous areas which are not naturally visible from the operator's position. The manufacturer shall provide devices. So what does that look like? It could be equipment to give the operator a clear view of the hazardous area, e.g. mirrors or CCTV. Okay, so the question there is that present on the device or is that present on the machinery? Yes or no, and we can do our assessment based on that. So if we jump back to our risk assessment, we can just have a look at a couple of examples of that. So we've taken that and we've then laid it out so that you have the specific hazards, the hazardous situation, the safety measures, which are kind of elaborated on from the standard reference, and then whether or not there is a suitable existing control measure or there needs to be some attention focused on that particular area, because whatever the control measure is in place either is not there or is simply not suitable, and we can comment on what would good or what would correct look like. So an example of that, so in general, thinking about mechanical hazards, unauthorized access into hazardous work zones. So there's a requirement in there to provide devices to give clear view to access not visible from the control stand. So that we were looking at for the manipulator, so I think it was 5.1.10. This is from the control stand looking at the forge itself. So this is within, again, 14673. So we're looking at section 5.1.15. And the requirement, so there wasn't, in this case, a means of having clear view of the working area. So we've stipulated that control operator, manipulator, operator has limited visibility. Windows aren't free from reflections, which is a requirement of the standard within 5.1.22. And we're stating that CCTV should be considered as a suitable solution in this case. Okay, so here's another example. So we're thinking again, this is another crushing, shearing, cutting, severing, or entanglement hazard. So access to moving parts of the machinery. They've got examples, so chains, sprockets, belts, and pulleys, and rotating drive shafts. They need to have limited access. So the standard requires total enclosure or totally enclose in the machine frame or provide local fixed guards which prevent access to the injury-causing components. Okay, and then we've got the citation within the standard here. So we observed that access to the rear of the press, there was a guard there, but it wasn't interlocked. So around the back of the press, someone could be there, the guard could be open, and the operator who had limited visibility at the front would have no idea. So in that instance, appropriate interlocking of guarding is advisable, should be in place, would therefore meet the requirements of the standard. So down here, we've done the same thing with the manipulator. We've pulled the requirements from the crane standard, which in this case is EN 14238. So for cranes, manually controlled load manipulating devices. So here we've got electrical hazards. So electrical hazards, contact of persons with live parts. So there's your hazard identified. What's the fault condition? So electrical insulation fails, or there's an electrical insulation fault. The requirement of the standard is that electrical components should be in accordance with 60204 Part 1. Yep. And what was observed? Well, I had two things observed. One, there was an electrical panel that was damaged, it was badly dented, and there was an electrical panel door that didn't have appropriate tether between the enclosure itself and the door. So there's a couple of things that were identified there where, should there be further damage or should there be an issue with the insulation, there might be a fault where someone would be exposed to live electrical parts. Okay, and that's taken within the standard. We've had a little look there at how do we use harmonized standards, how do we use industry best practice, how do we use benchmarked standards to identify hazards within machinery, how do we use them to then check whether the implementing measures or the control measures that are currently in place are suitable for the hazards that they are related to. And hopefully we've seen that in kind of a tangible format, and I hope this has been helpful.